Who actually controls the internet? I mean, one of the answers to that question is we do. The people who produce the material do. The people who make money on it do. But we're thinking in the more traditional governmental sense, who can exert control of the internet?
Is anybody in charge of the internet?
The government controls it.
Elves, obviously elves.
The people who control the Wi-Fi, because then no Wi-Fi, no internet.
T-Mobile, Xfinity.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Right?
The honest answer is, well, nobody, and maybe another answer is everybody.
This has changed over time, the ideal of who might be able to and who actually can. Very early on, it was seen as this space outside of social control. It was a sort of liminal space. It was somewhere your mind went, and therefore, just like a book or a movie, it was something outside of the control of the state. Part of that was because there was only so much bad stuff you could do there. You know, you couldn't really engage in things that were traditionally considered crimes. It was thought you really couldn't steal from people or attack them or hurt them. That made it easier for the early pioneers of the internet to claim that it was a separate space, and that it rejected, to take John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace claim, it rejected the authority of the traditional state and of government and of control and of police. That these were things for the real world and not for cyberspace, not for this new virtual space. Some of that, and frankly, early on, the state was not that interested in it. This was this place where weirdos hung out, where nerds went to play, where people were posting stuff, sure, but that's free speech, so that's okay. Governments weren't very interested in that. In 1994, the rules against commercial use of the internet were pulled back, and people gradually got online and started selling things and buying things. As soon as money is involved, the idea of policing that money becomes much more important. And people started to do things online that folks didn't like, especially as it moved from being a fairly US-centric space to being a global space. The ideals of free speech, although they are put into the constitutions of almost every country in the world, are interpreted very, very differently. And so many people did not like to see speech against their rulers or against the ruling party or against the system appearing online, seditious speech. So very gradually, governments tried to create the kinds of controls that they found in the real world and recreate them in cyberspace. One of the major problems with that was the question of jurisdiction. Because while there are borders at national borders, even if they could be more or less protected. In some parts of the world, you can cross over a border and not even realize it. Certainly, that's true of state borders here. For cities that are right at the edge of a state border, you can drive back and forth across that many times every day without even realizing it. But the border itself, the police know where that border is, and they know who's responsible for what happens on either side. Cyberspace is this blob. There isn't a very clear delineation between which part of that blob is in Canada and which part of that blob is in Greenland and which part of that blob is in Hong Kong. Because people can access the same sites from those three places without any restrictions. The site might be hosted in those three places, especially with the cloud. It might be hosted in all three of those places at the same time. So it gets very confusing where to draw those borders. Nonetheless, there became efforts to create borders in cyberspace, to create the kinds of restrictions that at the very least said these people are under our control and need to adhere to our laws. The most obvious example of that, or at least the most frequently referenced, is what's called the Great Firewall of China. But there were other efforts as well of being able to engage in the internet. It wasn't a binary choice. There were places, sometimes quite late, where there was no access to the internet at all, and that was the way they controlled it. But one of the ministers of culture in Singapore described it as kind of, you wanted it to be a cell wall, right? You wanted to have a border but have it be permeable. Singapore is built on international trade. It's an entrepot. It's a space where people kind of go in and out and trade and move goods. And so they wanted to do the same thing for services and intellectual property. But they also, at the time especially, were a fairly restrictive state. You were not allowed to say anything that might disrupt racial tensions, that you weren't allowed to say anything that was directly critical of the government. And so they wanted to put some restrictions on it. At the time, for example, in Singapore, you needed to have a license in order to operate a color copier for that reason. You may even need a license to operate any copier, but I know that you needed one for a color copier. And so in many places, they tried to figure out, how is it that we put walls there? One is to put something like a what's incorrectly kind of referred to as a firewall, where you actually can put gates on the information leaving and coming into the country. And the other possibility is you license the people in those spaces. But let's leave that aside for a second and ask, is there a president of the internet? What about running the internet itself? Because aside from the laws that exist within the countries, the internet itself needs something like the internet police, right? Well, there is no internet police, you know that. But who is it that kind of makes the decisions and controls the moves? One of the groups that does this is the Internet Engineering Task Force. And they establish, I guess, the rules, the protocols by which interaction happens. But those tend to be just a matter of efficiency. They're not a matter of, generally speaking, they're not a matter of who gets to do what. That's not quite true, because those codes do encode certain kinds of social controls. But largely they're matters of engineering decision making. I will say this is not IETF, but there is some question as to, recently there have been rules about how you include video content on a website, and those definitely do start to cross over questions of national laws. Generally, if people think about governance on the net, many would think of the companies that actually support the net, right? The people who carry the traffic, the people who own the backbones, the actual physical infrastructure. It's been a very messy way that the internet has kind of evolved using those networks. Traditionally, they've been used. They've organized themselves around peering agreements, which said, yes, you can use my network to carry the internet if I can use yours, and that's worked fairly well. Naturally, in recent years, we've had some questions that have come up about building kind of walls around that infrastructural piece. This is especially the question that comes in with network neutrality rules. But generally speaking, the companies who actually build the stuff and support the stuff that let the networks work have managed to get along with the major backbones through peering agreements, and then people kind of just contracting to use those networks. And they've worked pretty well in this kind of haphazard way for a good several decades now. There is something called ICANN and the IANA. These are two companies actually, although they're nonprofit companies, two organizations that control what you might call the phone book of the internet. They control both who gets IP numbers and which networks get those IP numbers and how they get assigned, and then also the registrars, who gets to register names. So diving just very briefly, touching on the technical piece of this, every computer that is on the internet needs an IP address, roughly speaking, or at least needs to be borrowing an IP address. Everybody needs this address. It's a little bit like your phone number. But we don't really see those addresses for the most part. Generally, you aren't ever going to type an IP address into your web browser. Every once in a while, you might have to touch on it if you have to set up your mail client or something like that. But generally speaking, this is the numbers from 1 to 255. Something dot something dot something dot something. Although that's the old-fashioned way because we ran out of numbers. Now it's a much longer number that it's even less likely that you'll see. It's less likely that you'll see in the same way that you probably know your own phone number and probably no other number, because we never really have to think about phone numbers anymore. I used to remember probably a dozen phone numbers of people that I knew that I just had kind of programmed into my brain because you couldn't program it into your phone. And eventually you could program it into your home phone, but that was just a weird thing to do because you just knew those, right? Well, we don't deal with IP addresses for the same reason. We use the DNS system, the domain name system, in order to associate each of those with a name like google.com or like im.ninja or whatever, right? These various registrars that register they work like phone books, that register your number and then what name you want associated with it and kind of manage that. This is an essential it's very difficult to make the internet work without both the numbers and then the names associated with those numbers. And so that is maybe as centralized a form of control as you can think of. If you took down the major root DNS servers, it would make the internet almost impossible to use. So those are kind of a point of control. Traditionally, that company had on the board of directors had the director of CIA, the director of NSA, this kind of a couple of U.S. generals. It was very U.S. centric. Over time, it has lost its connection to the United States. In fact, only really over the last few years has it fully become independent from the U.S. It's had representation from around the world for a decade and a half, but it is now kind of its own separate entity that is not a quasi-governmental agency of the U.S. So the internet is no longer, sort of the domain of the United States, despite the U.S. being fairly central on that network. So that's as close as we get to kind of internet police. They do have some role, which we'll talk about when we touch on intellectual property, but generally speaking, the enforcement falls to the individual countries. So you can have something like the Great Firewall, or really a kill switch. There was a proposal from President Obama that he get access to a big red button that would shut off the internet, or that would at least separate it from the rest of the world. This seems bizarre, but it's not that uncommon. And even if you didn't have an actual kill switch, most of the traffic that is international traffic goes through wires, and they are large bundles of wires. So, there have been incidents where suddenly the wires have been cut, going into Egypt, for example. These are generally submarine cables, and there has been discussion over which countries have the capability of going down with a submarine and cutting those cables. So that's a possibility. Or the government can go into where those cables come into the country and pull a big switch and say, we're now disconnected from the rest of the world in terms of internet traffic. That's an extreme move, but it's possible. A friend of mine lives in South Africa and brings his students to see where all of the traffic for Africa, or at least sub-Saharan Africa, comes into the country. And it's this, the cable comes up on the beach and there it is. It's, this big round fiber optic set of cables. And so, if someone blew that up or it would take a while with an axe or a saw, but cut it off, you basically have cut off sub-Saharan Africa from the internet. So it is possible to actually do that physical restriction, but a lot of this has been done through this combination of filtering what comes in and out, filtering the IP addresses so that you can't get access to things like Facebook in China without doing some tricky stuff, or restricting how people find things. So, for example, the government in China has told Google that they can blacklist certain things on the Google search engine. And when Google was iffy about this, they helped to support actually 3 of the largest search engines in the world, but one of them, Baidu, which is at this point very much a rival for Google in terms of what it catalogs and in terms of its user base. So there are ways you can kind of start to restrict that and start to watch it. As I said, you can license users, and this has happened in various places. Or you can just pass laws, right? So even though you can't get on the internet necessarily to stop things beforehand, you can pass laws that say that if you do something on the internet and it's available in our country, you are then liable under our laws. And so what kinds of laws are those? Well, in the United States, one of the first major pieces of legislation around the internet was called the CDA, the Communications Decency Act. And this was an attempt to make the internet decent, To understand what that means, you need to know just the bare minimum about what decency and obscenity laws are in the U.S. And I won't go through the deep history, but generally speaking, there are a set of laws that say that you cannot share indecent things on broadcast networks. These are becoming kind of moot because we don't use over-the-air broadcasting as much as we used to. But this is why you can't say there are the 7 words you can't say on TV or radio, the George Carlin piece. And this is why when Janet Jackson's nipple showed up on television, it was a big deal. So these are things that are certainly legal. They are legal for adults to see in the U.S., nipples and bad words. But they are indecent, which means that generally speaking, you can't have them on broadcast TV or broadcast radio. There's a lot of reasoning behind that, we won't get into. And then there are things that are obscene. Obscenity law in the U.S. restricts some things that no one is allowed to ever see. So, for example, you're not ever allowed to see child pornography. It is illegal in all forms. And there's even things that kind of bleed over. There's a Supreme Court case over virtual child pornography. Can you see child pornography if no children were used in the making of it? Can you have child pornography where it's children who are in sexy clothing? Is that enough to make it child pornography? The answer is yes. So, even tight clothing, if the intent is to titillate. So those are obscene. They're actually illegal. You go to jail, even if you accidentally download some child porn, you go to jail. It doesn't matter who's seeing it, you go to jail. You can't be a university professor and say, I'm researching this, and if you do that, you go to jail. So that stuff is stuff that is actually purely illegal, and child porn is kind of the key example of that. So in between that are things that are adult stuff. They are R-rated movies. They are pornography that is legal for adults, that is protected by the First Amendment. And the CDA said the internet needed to be decent. That means it needed to be treated like a broadcast network. That meant that if you sent an email to someone calling them, calling them something that included those 7 dirty words, that you could then be arrested for transmitting indecent material over the internet. It meant, for example, that sites that had pictures of the Venus de Milo or sites that talked about breast cancer would suddenly be illegal. It was a really bad law, and there's a reason it came about. It's because senators are stupid, but also because they were easily misled by a series of very bad pseudo-studies. So we ended up with this very bad law, the CDA, and suddenly people realized this was bad stuff, and the court stepped in eventually and struck it down. But it became that first touch point. It's where the Electronic Frontier Foundation came from, and a number of other activists around the internet. But we still have laws about pornography and how it can be transmitted on the internet. We now have laws about the kinds of especially outside the U.S., there are laws that restrict certain kinds of speech that are perfectly legal in the United States and illegal in other places. For example, certain expressions of racism and certain expressions of political belief, which might include forms of racism. And in particular here, I'm talking about Nazism. You're not allowed in Germany to share Nazi symbols, period. You're not allowed to sell Nazi paraphernalia. You're not allowed to put up a Nazi flag, a swastika in any form. So, this is in Germany illegal. And so obviously it's also illegal online in Germany, because if it's illegal in books and printed materials, you can't do any of that stuff there. Obviously the German internet, whatever that would be, shouldn't include these things either. And that means if you're Google and someone in Germany calls up your site and it happens to, searches for Martin Luther King, and instead, and this was true for a long time, you ended up in an anti-Semitic site that said King was this horrible person. If you're Google and you send them to that site, you're now violating German law. And so that might not matter to you if you're only in Germany and you never plan to, if you're only in the United States and you never plan to travel to Germany and you have no sort of corporate interests in Germany. But of course Google does. They have corporate interests in Germany and they have corporate interests in China. So they instead create a Google search engine in Germany that only provides materials that do not include links to Nazi paraphernalia. So that is one of the other ways you can do it. You can create laws in these countries that then apply to the internet. And, this is a question of habeas corpus. If you can get at control of the person themselves, in one case, we've had racists that have gone to other countries and been arrested as they got off the plane. So if you can get the body of the person who's violated the local law, or if you can get their assets, which are often much more easily pulled, then you can control what they're doing on the internet. And that is, by and large, the biggest piece of governmental control of the internet. The key battleground here is intellectual property. I can go right now and call up the Pirate Bay. I can do that despite years and years of different governments trying to get rid of that website. And so this is because the internet is an intellectual sphere. Intellectual property ends up being the largest flashpoint. And we'll have to leave the question of how to deal with that to another lecture, but that's the point where the control goes from, you can't really get at the control as easily as you have been. And that's often been the place that people have tried to assert new kinds of freedoms. And so that is the battle point for the control of the internet right now.